This is the Heroes for Freedom podcast. I'm Rick Robinson. Sacagawea, Sally, and Elijah. Why history's heroes are essential to our children's survival today. Sally would never forget the summer following her sixth winter, the day the dog-faced men rode out of the sun. Drawn to the sound, she crept silently, moving among the trees like a shadow. Sally scooted up the barren fir tree before her, on a safe perch flattened behind the trunk, mastering the skill of camouflage from squirrel. She spotted the man-creature skulking the bush below. He was eyeing the village women bathing in the river. At first she thought it might be Neppy, the legendary Blackfoot trickster who had come to cast evil upon her village. But the fellow appeared consumed, even spellbound by what should be a common sight. Then he turned towards her, and her heart stopped. There, the white man held the face of the grizzled dog of her vision, the wellspring of all evil, now penetrating her heart. In 1825, the renegades, Indian and white, surrounded 6-year-old Sally's Shoshone village in the pre-dawn raid in the shadows of the Wind River Mountains of what would become Wyoming. They sought scalps and captives they could abuse and then sell. Sweeping through the Shoshone village, the raiders killed the men outright, torturing then murdering the women, and capturing a number of children, including the Shoshone girl we know as Sally. The brutality was unspeakable. But fortunately for my triple great-grandmother, Sally was rescued by a kind-hearted mountain man nearby who was headed back to St. Louis. There she was raised by a compassionate Christian family, where she was educated in the ways of the whites. But when 15 years old, she longed for the great Rocky Mountains of home. So she set off alone on her quest, following the Missouri River westward, seeking its headwaters, and into an adventure rarely, if ever, repeated by a teen in the history of any nation. Her story is found, in fact, in the Heroes for Freedom manual series. You can see the copies over my shoulder, and also the link is available in the show notes below. Another history-changing example, a full generation actually before Sally, was the Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark expedition, Lewis and Clark, of course, 1803 to 1806, known as the Corps of Discovery. The American expedition to explore newly acquired lands of the Louisiana Purchase. The men of the Corps of Discovery would travel from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, across America's heartland, up the Missouri River, over the Continental Divide to the Pacific Ocean, through the uncharted lands of the great American West. As Lewis and Clark moved, they mapped this mysterious continent, meeting and learning from the indigenous tribes, essentially unknown to the citizens of the fledgling United States. Finishing their journey in a 2.5 years, journey, wow, 2.5 years. Many thought they weren't going to return, in fact, but they did, alive and well. It had been predicted, in fact, that they would be swallowed up by the vast West and never heard from again. But like us seriously optimistic Americans have always done, they trusted in their own native grit and in a God who never let them down. But more to the point of our story, they placed their trust in a young Shoshone woman who amazingly was still in her teens. In the end, the Corps of Discovery opened a vast continent to the mountain men, trappers, and trailblazers who would follow, at first but a trickle, a wisp of smoke, leaving barely a shallow moccasin track on the land. But later, intrepid settlers and farmers, then shopkeepers and city dwellers would come from every land. Almost all of them were dirt poor, with literally nothing to go back to, trailing the sun across these mostly desert lands. Many of them were immigrants who barely spoke English, in fact. And surprisingly to me, many had never owned a gun, let alone shot one. A gun, it seems like a necessity, but it was a luxury they could never afford. They peered into the dark forests and vast sandy wastelands with a mixture of fear and fascination. Essentially all my ancestors, going back 250 years, were among them. And upon their arrival, they met my other ancestors, the Shoshone, who had lived on this land seemingly forever. Except for the fertile and well-watered Oregon Territory, however, they found a mostly barren landscape, forcing them to scrape a living out of the rocky or alkali soil with bloodied hands, while fighting off wild animals, bandits, disease, and Indians, and burying their children along the way. Thousands, both Indian and white, drenched the soil with their blood. Above all, they loved freedom dearly, beholden to no man, nurturing a faith in God and a hope that they could grow and prosper as part of this new Israel, a God-gifted promised land preserved for them, they believed. We must remember, however, that none would have come for many additional years had it not been for these first intrepid explorers and trailblazers, many of them Indian as well. And Meriwether Lewis and William Clark would not have survived without the help and know-how of the teenage Shoshone girl we know as Sacagawea. Sacagawea was the child bride of the French explorer Toussaint Charbonneau, who joined, in fact, the expedition of the Corps of Discovery on the plains. Sacagawea, which means bird woman or bird girl, was Lemhi Shoshone. She was taken as a slave at the age of 12 by a Hidatsa raiding party who killed many in her village and stole the young women and children. Of course, they were easier to manipulate and control, and then, of course, planning to sell them as slaves. The French trapper and explorer, Toussaint Charbonneau, bought Sacagawea from the Hidatsa and made her his teenage bride. She was pregnant when first meeting the Corps of Discovery, giving birth shortly after Lewis and Clark had arrived at Fort Mandan, which is located in the modern state of North Dakota. The intrepid Charbonneau decided to join the expedition, so Sacagawea and her newborn son went along. It was fortunate she did, for she saved the expedition several times. Part of the journey was through Shoshone territory. She provided translation and interpretation, which of course are two very different skills, calming and disarming potential attackers with her skilled words and ways. This story, while most consider unique in our history, in truth has been repeated many times, both in frontier times but also more recently, such as calling upon American Indian tribes to help defeat Japan and the Nazis. The Navajo Code Talkers was just one example, saved the lives of countless U.S. Marines in World War II, in some of the most bloody battles in the Pacific War. America is exceptional today, largely because we are fashioned from Christian compassion and cooperation, combining so perfectly with traditional American Indian know-how and grit. Remember, I know this to be true personally from the stories told me by my ancestors. My triple great-grandmother, Sally, as mentioned, like Sacagawea, was also Shoshone. As a teenager, she married a young trailblazer, Elijah Ward, from Virginia. His mentor was Jim Bridger, the famous American mountain man who was about 10 years older than Elijah. Sally and Elijah spent the remainder of their lives helping the many groups of pioneers to survive in the harsh Great Basin of Utah and southern Idaho. For years, until both Elijah and Sally were tragically killed protecting the downtrodden, they struggled to defend both cultures, Indian and white, trying desperately to find common ground. They were not agitators, or were they hate-driven protesters? No. For engaging in such divisive, unproductive behavior would have never crossed their minds. But we know from family journals and stories they certainly did have legitimate grievances. To their credit, Sally and Elijah seemed to understand that you counter ignorance and prejudice by becoming bridge builders and helpers, offering peace and friendship, offering security and help to those who were struggling. During their lives, among both Indian and white, they experienced conflict, bloodshed, and war. They understood war, they truly did, and they risked everything trying to prevent it. In the end, they made a difference because they had something of value to offer, not because of some mandated program to include them because of the color of their skin or because they were deemed victims. Grounded in honor and truth, I know Sally and Elijah would have rejected something so dishonest and so patronizing. That's not what Sacagawea or Sally or Elijah were ever about. They spent their lives, short lives, helping others, healing others, loving others, and leaving a legacy that is the true strength and virtue upon which this great nation was built. We have an American legacy to live up to, my friends, of honest heroes, making genuine contributions that actually bettered people's lives and helped strengthen our great nation. Again, not wanting to sound like a broken record, but that's why it's essential we teach our children about the noble and great ones of our past, to emulate their lives of genuine service and sacrifice that our nation so desperately needs right now. More so, it's what our children need. In the words of the great Roman philosopher and statesman Cicero, he said, quote, "To be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child, for what is the worth of human life unless it is woven into the lives of our ancestors by the records of history," unquote. The United States of America is not just any country. I think we know that. The world looks to us for leadership, prosperity, but most of all as a bulwark against tyranny. Lord help us if we forget that this great nation was called by God from the beginning to bless and rescue our world. And these trailblazers taught us how that's to be done. As I've said many times, without them, we would not recognize our world today. But in truth, we would not recognize ourselves. I'm Rick Robison, and this is the Heroes for Freedom podcast.